Today, we are diving into Genesis 42. Y'all, sorry about my voice, and my voice is gone. So in Genesis chapter 42, we're going to learn about how God uses trials for restoration. In our last devotional, we reflected on how stepping into God's calling can often look or feel crazy. But once we say yes, we realize that God's plans involve seasons of testing, not to harm us, but to refine us. These tests can be painful, but they immediately or ultimately lead to restoration and healing. Let's look at Joseph. Betrayed by his brothers, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, and imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit. Joseph could have easily lost hope, but through it all, he remained faithful and obedient to God's calling, even in the hardest places. And now in Genesis 42, we see the fruits of that obedience. When Joseph's brother came to Egypt seeking grain, he was faced with a choice. These were the same brothers who had plotted against him and caused them years of suffering. Joseph had every reason to retaliate, but he didn't react out of anger. He didn't hold on to bitterness. By the time his brothers came seeking grain, Joseph had been elevated to a position of power. He had the authority to take revenge or extend grace, and he chose grace. Joseph chose to remain faithful and obedient to God. He could see that his trials had a purpose and that even his pain was part of God's bigger plan and God's bigger story for his life. Sometimes it's hard to see the purpose behind the pain while we are in it. But when we remain faithful, God gives us the clarity to understand that He's working all things for our good. What test are you facing right now? Are you leaning into God for strength, for wisdom and understanding, just like Joseph did? Or are you holding on to bitterness and missing the bigger picture of what God is trying to do for you and through you? Joseph's story reminds us that God's plan doesn't just stop at calling us. There are tests along the way, and those tests are part of God's preparation for something greater. When we remain faithful and obedient to God, even in the hardest places, He can use us as instruments of healing, instruments of restoration, instruments of deliverance. What Joseph's brother meant for harm, God turned into a powerful tool for reconciliation, salvation, and renewal, not just for Joseph, but for the entire nation of Israel. I pray that this chapter in Genesis 42 encourages both you and me to learn to trust in God's process, to endure the test, and to remember that your faithfulness and obedience can bring restoration to others and other generations to come. Love you, friends. Stay faithful and stay healthy.